Let's do a pro photographer review for the top M3 Max versus the base M3 Max and determine if the extra $500 is worth it. This is ArtIsRight. A big thank you and welcome to those of you who have already subscribed. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so and help us grow the channel, because the more subscribers we have, the more views we're going to get as well. In addition to that, one thing that all of you can help me with is to tap on that like button. This way YouTube algorithm will push this video to an even larger audience. As usual, I'll be sharing with you a lot of information. I highly encourage that you pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself, in addition to the analysis that I'll be sharing with you. Timestamp will be in the description. I may not remember to do it right away, but it will be in there at some point in time. All right, with that being said, if you find the information that I'm sharing with you helpful, please consider supporting the channel. Link to my tip jar will be in the description. You can also choose to use YouTube Super Thanks. And one thing that I'm trying out right now is a new YouTube membership that you will get priority replies on any of comments or question that you ask. So that's definitely something to consider to support the channel that way, but I greatly appreciate all of you. All right, now with this being said, there are two primary test systems that we are going to be looking at. This would be the M3 Max, the base one, and the top one. So the variation with this, unlike the previous generation M1, M2, there is the variation in the CPU and the GPU. On the M1, M2, the CPU are the same, the GPU does vary. So a couple of things we're gonna look at here is we're going from 14 to 16 CPU core, and the distribution of that is very similar enough where we get 10 performance versus 12 performance core. So we get 2 more performance core. We're going to see if this is going to amount to much in the pro apps that we use for photography. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we're going from 30 to 40 GPU core, and regarding the memory bandwidth, we are talking about 300 versus 400, which really doesn't amount to that much of a real world variation. So I probably would not even think or even worry about that. As far as memory go for both of these stock configuration, the base one starts at 36 gigabytes of memory and the top one starts at 48. Now, memory configuration is another one of those things where it's tied directly to the SoC, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on in this video as well. Both of them have 1 terabyte SSD. Here's the thought regarding the memory that I have. So the price variation, the $500, apply for both the 16 and also the 14-inch model. This is the 14 that you are looking right now at, and this is pretty much the base. This is the top. Now, the thing is that when you pick the top SoC, Apple does two things. You're really paying for the SoC upgrade, but because that RAM, the amount that is available and tied to the chip, is pretty much grouped together, you're also paying an extra $200 for the slight bump in memory as well. So this is the reason why the price is a $500 delta. Similarly, on the 16-inch, you can see the price range there as well. And these are some of the additional test systems that I have. So we have the M3 Pro base and the M3 Pro top that we're going to be adding results in. Both from the M1 and M2 generation, both Pro and Max are going to be there, and all these additional other test systems as well. The one thing that I already mentioned about this is the memory bandwidth. You're not really going to see any difference. I'll leave a link to this video in the description. This is testing using the M1, but essentially what it really comes down to is that the app that we have nowadays doesn't really go in and utilize the memory bandwidth that much at all. So it doesn't really make that much of a difference, essentially, with the memory bandwidth difference. Some additional test system, we are going to be looking at the M1 Ultra, M2 Ultra as well. In addition to all these videos that I have already released on my channel, definitely make sure you check them out. This way you can see what is this generation chip really up to. All right, so a few things to notice that I have gone in and retested everything, clean install macOS Sonoma, either running on 14.1 or 14.1.1 on that, and all the apps are the current version that are being distributed that you and me are pretty much using today. These are not any special beta apps or anything like that at all. As far as battery goes, I know many of you have been asking for this. It does take a while to really run the battery test. I ran a test on this with a brand new battery in the M1 generation. I'll leave a link to that video below. And what it really comes down to regarding the battery, we can be concerned and overly concerned about all these specs. What I'm going to tell you is choose the computer and the size and also the SoC that you need for your workflow. If the battery lasts a little bit shorter, I hear you, I understand, but I'm also going to say it's actually much longer than the previous generation Intel that have actually come from in the past. So I think we are in a much better position because of that. Now, as far as display calibration goes, all of these M3 generation, M3, M3 Pro, M3 Max, all work with Calibrate Profiler and their HL devices to run a full calibration on these new XDR displays, or the Apple Liquid Retina XDR displays, and it also works with BenQ hardware calibrate display as well with Palette Master Ultimate. These have been checked. If you want to learn how to calibrate these display with Calibrate HL device, I made the ultimate guide. Links will be in the description as well. All right, so this will be a pro photo review, and I am going to do single app testing. I know we all multitask. I do that too. If you multitask, just get more RAM, but I want to see how the silicon is performing one generation to next. As far as test configuration go, I know I get a lot of comments. Can you test this memory? Can you test that memory? I mentioned this already at the beginning of this cycle that I'm going to focus more on stock machines, because starting to customize things, people are going to want to know how the stocks are performing. But if I end up buying every configuration, it's so costly that it's, let me simply put it this way. The income from this YouTube channel doesn't really justify that yet. Now, but if you subscribe, if I get more watch and more views and the ad revenue becomes higher, then yeah, I'll definitely look into doing more of those in the future as well. So it's one of those things where please help me so that I can help you. All right, but a lot of this can really be done through data extrapolation, and like I said, I am unable to test all these before. Now, the effect of the SSD, the speed, the size and everything, and the RAM is known at this point. This is in the 3rd generation. I mean, we already know if we increase the RAM, how much of a speed boost we are going to get. And simply, I would just look at the charts and look at how the memory distribution on the chart is. You can see on many of them, as we go up in memory, the time does decrease. You're going to get that as well when you double the memory on the machine or you increase the memory in your configuration. So this is how you're going to read the specs, and this is the cheat sheet. I received one comment that I'm not sure what MS M1U is. So MS Max Studio, M1U is M1 Ultra. You can always refer back to this and find out what's going on. All right, SSD. Once you configure this, it is pretty much fixed. You and me can't really easily go in and upgrade it. Simply put it that way. You can always link an external drive and expand the storage on your machine so you're not stuck with it. And that's the good thing about the SSD. I would tell you to configure the SSD just based on the need and use case and not for speed. So don't go out and buy a larger SSD because you're going to gain an extra 1,000 megabytes per second. If your workflow can't see that or can't even use that much in the first place, you're just spending extra money not to really utilize that return. And the point of diminishing return for you, maybe at just the 512, I'm just saying. But the timing between both of these machines, the max top and the base, are pretty much very similar to each other. So the SSD is all good. Here it is comparing with all the M3 generations so far. So M3, M3 Pro, base, M3 Pro top, max base, and max top. You can see from the chart there. And here it is with all the other machines in a lineup. Like I said, you can pause this and review yourself. Now, regarding assets stored internally versus externally, are you going to see any time variation? The answer to that is nil. I'll leave a link to this video in the description. You want to check that out. But essentially, plugging an external SSD to your system, you're going to be fine running your creative app because it doesn't really take that much throughput at all. Again, our apps are really fairly antiquated, and it doesn't utilize a new architecture on these new machines. As far as memory or the RAM in the system go, you really need to consider a use case. If you are crazy like me, have too many browsers and tabs open, and leave them running and have many other apps open, you want to think about getting more RAM. This way, your system has more of that fast memory so it can use it right away. It is non-upgradable, so just be certain of that you get what you need. And the other thing is that there is no way to expand this. Unlike an SSD where you can plug in an extra drive and do this, you can't do this with the RAM. And remember that it is shared between the CPU and GPU. One more thing is that less is not more with these RAM. One more thing is that less is not more with these RAM, less is still less. So if you think you're gonna need more, and if you're a pro, definitely go in and bump the memory up. It's going to help. One thing that all of you can do, if you're a pro and you're not sure, if you have a Mac already, restart it, launch Activity Monitor, go into the memory tab and monitor the memory pressure. Tile your windows in a way that you can see this as you launch your creative app and go through your workflow and see how your memory pressure is. Green, you're good. Yellow, you might want to consider getting more memory in your next machine. Red, it is definitely time to upgrade. Another app that you can use as well is a program such as iStat Menu, because it will keep track of your memory pressure and your memory usage up to 30 days. And that's the one thing that I really like about this app. Links will be in the description as well. If you're coming from an Intel machine, one advice that I have for you is to keep the memory pretty much the same as what you have on your Intel, if not more. That's all I'm going to say there, because you definitely don't want to run into a slowdown or running out of memory. As far as per professional goes, I recommend getting 32 plus gigabyte memory, or in these machines, it'll be 36, but you can really determine how much you really want in terms of memory and how much you want to get. But with these machines, if you're looking at the Macs already, you're going to be pretty much good to go from the get-go. Now, remember that one more thing about the memory as well is that your OS is also using the memory. So just because you have that 36 gigabytes of memory, it doesn't mean that the app can go in and use 36 gigabytes of it freely. Around 6 to 10 gigabytes of that is being used to run the operating system. So keep that in mind too. All right, Lightroom Classic 13.0.1 full acceleration. Let's compare the two. 1000 Nikon D850 1:1 preview. When it comes to timing, we are looking at about a minute and around 15 seconds or so, probably not exact math, but you get the idea, faster. Now, is this really worth an extra $500? This is something that you really need to ask yourself. So the top spec one is definitely a faster machine, you can see there, but it's by about a minute and 15 seconds. I don't think this is that much of a delta at all between gaining 2 extra CPU cores. So let's continue. Comparing this with the rest of the computer in a lineup, we see the numbers right here. So we are taking a look at these two configurations, the max between the base and the top. And you can see right now that they are pretty much already tethering in the M1 Ultra and the M2 Ultra speed at this point. Getting really close there, only about a few minutes apart. A lot of interesting things to consider. What about export? The top one is still pulling ahead, but we're talking about a little bit over a minute. This is where I mentioned that this $500, you need to determine if this is really worth it for you or not, when you're really talking about just minute in variation. And this is not a minute for one file, this is a minute for 1,000 files. So think about that. When we add this to the rest in the lineup, we can see that the max, both the top and the base spec, is clustering at the top there and is trailing behind the M1 Ultra and the M2 Ultra. As far as the rest of the machine and lineup go, you can check. And I'm fairly sure that I corrected most of the mistakes I made on these numbering or these specs for the machine already, but if you've seen anything, point them out, let me know, I will pin a comment. All right, Lightroom Classic HDR Merge 9 Nikon D810 file. Taking a look at this, 32 seconds. This is within a margin of error of each other, so they are pretty much the same. And with this, when we take a look at this, we can see that all the M3 generation machines are clustering at the top. So they are performing fairly well. Their CPU is faster frequency-wise, but it's not that huge variation that you're really expecting to see. They're really close to the previous generation as well. They're just consistently showing faster, better core frequency. All right, Panorama Merge. 314 megapixel file DNG that's resulting from merging 14 Nikon D810 36 megapixel each together. And for that, we get a time variation of, well, pretty much 3 seconds. This is within a margin of error. And the interesting about this is that we're talking about high memory on the system already. We're talking about 12 gigabytes more. That doesn't really do that much because you are already starting at a base amount of memory that is fairly high. Now, has this been half this amount, we're going to see this bar grow that much longer. And that would be, for example, in the Pro machines. And when we take a look at these results, so the top M3 Max versus the base M3 Max. And interesting enough, the M1 Max with 64 gigabytes of memory is pulling just about a second ahead. When they're about at seconds like this, they are within a margin of error. But a couple of things to note about this chart is that as we go up in memory, and I'm not talking about 16 to 18, but when we start to double the amount of memory or close to doing that, we start to see times getting cut. However, at some point we do reach a plateau, and I would say that that plateau is around 36 gigabytes or so. Because once we reach that 36 gigabyte, when we start to double that memory, you can see that it's not really reducing the time by half anymore. It's marginally reducing the time down. And that really comes down also with the CPU performance as well. So those are other factors to really think about when you're doing Panorama Merge. But if you want to have the best performance, I would say definitely Max is definitely the way to go. All right. Lightroom Classic AI Noise Reduction. This is a task that's supposed to be running on the NPU, the neural processing unit, but it hasn't been doing that. So right now it's running on a GPU, which is the graphical one. And pretty much this is for one file. Having a 10 extra GPU cores really accounts for a time difference of around 4 seconds or so. Now, this in one single image may not seem like a big deal, but when you compound this into multiple images that you're doing AI noise reduction at once, it's going to start to show the effect. And I'm working on a new test that I'm devising for this right now with more files. So we'll share with you in an addendum video when I launch those. But these are the two M3 the top specs and the base one clustering right next to the Ultra machine. This is how powerful they are in this generation, but relatively speaking, between the two of them, we're starting to really see whether $500 is worth it or not, especially when it comes to the photo apps in the market right now that we have access to. This is Lightroom Desktop, Lightroom 7 or version 7. Timing between these two, it's pretty much just about the same, 2 seconds apart. And interesting enough, the base model is pulling 2 seconds faster. I'm going to count this to a margin of error, but it's not really seeing that much more. In fact, the base machines also has 12 GB less memory as well. Now, this is a task to use both CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination together. And that's the reason why I like to test this particular app, because it's a brand new code base. But we can see the timing there, and it's really teetering super close to the M1 Ultra, M2 Ultra, and that used to be the top pinnacle machine. I mean, in fact, M2 Ultra is the top pinnacle machine, but we're really giving those machines a run for the money. But if you start looking at the price tag, well, they are really clustering really close together as well as far as the laptop and desktop goes. So a lot of factors to think about there. Now, what I'm thinking is going to be very interesting is when we get the Mac Studio with these new M3 Macs on the inside. I think that's going to be awesome because it's going to give, for instance, the M2 Ultra definitely a run for the money. And when the M3 Ultra comes out, I have a feeling it's going to be mind-blowing. All right, Capture One 23 version 16.3.0.76. Timing between the two extra CPU cores account for a time variation of around less than 30 seconds variation or so. Not that big of a difference between these two machines. And this is also something that I have been saying for a very long time. If you're looking at Capture One, definitely look at the base Max SoC. Now, this is import. This is using CPU, so you may say, well, this is not really good metrics. That's true, but we're also going to see the export that uses GPU only as well. When it comes to these things, the top M3 Max, it's sitting at the top faster than the M2 Ultra, way faster than the M1 Ultra. And if you take a look at this chart, I mentioned this in so many videos already, this does not make a lot of sense, but this is the way how Capture One scales on the CPU, which is, to say the least, not good at all. When it comes to export, this is using GPU only, and the top spec one is pulling ahead by about a minute or a little bit less than a minute or so. This is not within the margin error. It is far enough apart from each other, but this variation, this 1 minute extra speed, is also $500. So definitely something to think about there. I am beginning to think that the base M3 Max is a very, very compelling option. Add this to the rest of the lineup. M3 Max top, M3 Max base are coming right at the top, amazingly enough. And this chart tells us a few things. I have been mentioning lately that the M2 Max base SoC, if you can get that one, which is this one right here, is still a top contender. So if your workflow does not involve that many other apps in photography and mostly revolves around Capture One, the M2 Max base SoC one is definitely one of the best contenders right now because the pricing are coming down. You don't need the latest and greatest for Capture One because it's not going to utilize the potential in your computer and the money you spend anyway. And that represents the best value at this point in time. Let's take a look at Photoshop. This is using Digital Lloyd chamber test. Puget system will come later on when they are out of beta so that the numbers are more consistent. And these are the 3 tests I'm running for Digital Lloyd. The link to his website will be in the description. When we take a look at the timing of this Photoshop speed between these two machines, they are pretty much within milliseconds of each other. So they're so close that you're not going to see any variation. Adding this to the rest of the machine, a couple things we do see very similar to the other charts, for example, with HDR merge as well. Things or tasks that uses CPU only and only a few cores, the frequency improvement is definitely really benefiting the speed in Photoshop. Now, we're only talking about seconds apart here, but if you're working with Photoshop day in, day out, this is something that will definitely make a difference. And this is also the reason why I recommend getting the M3 SoC if you're working with Photoshop. Particularly, the Pro one would be a really good option with an upgraded memory. All right. Photoshop Medium 15.7 gigabyte file. Remember that this is on a 16 or 18 gigabyte machine, filling up the memory for the entire system already, and it has to go into the swap on the disk for sure. So those are things to think about. Well, when we take a look at 36 and 48, there's enough memory to run this file or to really compute this file literally just on memory, and we're good. And timing between those are pretty much within milliseconds of each other, not that big of a deal. And this is also where having more memory on the system is definitely beneficial, but also there is a slight point of diminishing return. For example, 128 versus 64 is not performing that much faster because those are still on the old core as well, versus the newer core in the M3. Those are the M1, M2 is the previous generation. So the clock frequency may not be quite as high. It may not be as efficient as the current M3. And we start to see the variation in number there. Now, if you're working with Photoshop, don't get me wrong, if you're working in large files all the time, this M1 or M2 Ultra is still a really good combination for you to think about. All right, Photoshop Huge, 56 gigabyte. Now this is filling up the memory of this one and definitely this one already for sure. So this has to go into a swap. Now when you're looking at timing variation between these two, we're talking about 19 seconds variation. It's really not that big of a deal. And if you should run out of memory, that's okay because it's not too bad at all. And you have to really think about this really accounts not just only the memory bump for 12 gigabyte, but it's also an SoC upgrade of $500. So these are variations to think about. And if you're constantly working with these type of large files, I would highly encourage you to go in and bump up the memory because it's going to be a much more beneficial user experience for you in the long run. When we compare this with the rest of the lineup, we can see a couple of things happening in this chart clearly. As you go in and increase the amount of memory, you can see we start at 16, we go up to 128. This is a task where having enough memory on the system for Photoshop to run that file on this fast memory only, it's going to benefit. Now, a couple other things I also want to point out in this chart is that the M3 are clustering there. However, interestingly enough, when we talk about the M3, just the regular 3 SoC without the Max or the Pro, even though I mentioned in the previous video, it has a fairly fast throughput on the SSD, you can read and write fairly fast. However, when it comes to really performing in this type of environment, it's not doing that much better than, for example, the M2 and also the M1 generation of the past. So this is telling us that Apple may not be using the same type or quality of SSDs or the high throughput one when it comes in the Pro and the Max versus in just the base SoC one. So it's something to think about there. And also, as I mentioned before, if you're doing this professionally and you have paying clients paying you to do this, save yourself the time, upgrade it to the more pro-oriented SoC. You're gonna get a much better components in there anyway. All right, Final Cut Pro 10.6.10, comparing the H.2 64, same engine, same amount of time, 1 second apart, margin of error. Here it is with the rest of the machine. And this is also the reason why if you work with video workflow, I recommend getting the Max because you can see the export time cut in half. Now, I understand many of us will say that, hey, you know what? It doesn't really matter to me the export time. I want to run smooth on the timeline. For me, based on the file that I'm sharing with you right now, it runs smooth on my timeline with the basic effects I'm doing for the videos that you're seeing. It doesn't have any problem, but for your use case, if you have a heavy use case, it may be different. But the thing about getting the Max though is that when you need to render something, even just on the timeline, it's going to do it that much faster in half the amount of time because it goes into the encoder decoder engine. And that's going to save you the overall time you're working your files. HEVC 8-bit. We're talking about 3 seconds apart, not that big of a deal at all. And interestingly enough, the base one is faster by 3 seconds. These are within a margin of error, but you start to see the graph really going shorter depending on the generational SoC that you get, or the variant, for example, like the regular and the Pro, same encoder decoder engine. The Max have a separate one, and then the Ultra also has double the amount of that. And we start to get to see the effect of time reducing, and that's a good thing, especially for me anyway. ProRes 422, this is the timing exactly the same. And when we compare to the rest, the M1, M2 generation, just want to point that out, the regular SoC does not have the ProRes encoding engine, which is why it's taking that long. And when it comes to the M3, there is one, but it's not performing quite as well as the rest. And the timing between all of these, if you just work in ProRes, it's really not that big of a deal at all. And we're now going to look at Adobe After Effects using Adobe Benchmark, the timing between these two. Now, I export these in two different ways on these machines. One is using the Mercury, just software only CPU, and the other one is using a GPU. Now, the GPU is not enabled by default because it could cause color shifting in your final file, posterization, artifact, those kind of things, but I ran them both anyway. And the timing variation between the two is really small. Now, interestingly enough, when you have a task that goes in and use both CPU and GPU, particularly in this GPU chart, we're supposed to see timing becoming shorter, especially when we double from 40 to 30. but it's not really going to utilize the GPU that much at all. So this is telling us that After Effects, whether you use hardware or not, it's only a few seconds apart. But interesting though is that the top M3 Max is performing faster by about a minute compared to the base one. Considering this, I don't know. I mean, I still think that the base M3 Max is a really compelling option. Here it is, adding this in with the rest of the lineup. This is the top M3 Max CPU, GPU, and all the rest of the ones, if they are not annotated CPU, GPU, meaning that they're just using the GPU exports. So they are a few seconds faster than the CPU. But you can see the timing on the charts right there. Doesn't show that much variation. So what are some of my analysis, thoughts, and observation about this? Well, here's the 16-inch lineup. And when we take a look at this, we can see that there are 4 configurations that are stock from Apple. And we have the Max with the variation in the number of CPU and GPU core. This really amounts itself to around $500 variation because, as I explained in the very beginning of this video, you're upgrading the SoC for $300, but you're also upgrading the memory for $300. And it's the same type of upgrade that you would be doing on the 14-inch one as well. The 14-inch one span a broader array of range, and the stock one really just gets capped out at the base Max SoC, although you can upgrade the top one as well. But when you start to really look at that, the price is going to jump in the exact same way. Here's the 14 and 16, just looking at the Max SoC. Now, the price difference between the 14 and the 16 is $300. So you really need to ask yourself, do you need the larger chassis or not? I'm going to say this. When you're looking at these machines, think about your use case. If the 16-inch is going to be big and you want to work on a larger screen real estate, yeah, absolutely, sure, do that. But if it's too heavy for you, but you need the power, then get the 14-inch. Never mind the thermal. I never run into the throttling in any of these tests that I'm doing. Never mind the battery, because I also have the M2 Max in the 14-inch chassis, and it lasts just fine, even when I'm on the plane. So, you know, at some point we need to look beyond specs, and this is probably one of the good time for us to just be aware of it, but not really be obsessed over about trying to optimize everything, because I mean, at some point you're going to have to just get the machine and use it. All right. So the M3 Max base, as I mentioned before, this is where the dilemma comes in, because upgrading the memory to this one is not quite as straightforward. And I would argue that if you're getting the M3 Max base, I would just stick with 36 gigabyte memory, because the other memory upgrade you have is 96 gigabyte. That's around 2.6 times more. And it also carries a hefty price tag, because all the other ones, the way how they are tying the memory to the SoC or the spec of the chip, doesn't make it as a straightforward path to upgrade. That means you cannot upgrade between the base and the top SoC pretty much with the same amount of memory. It's not going to overlap each other. Smart way, but I'm also sure there are other engineering reasons behind this too. So we can see the price variation between those two, as I mentioned already, $300 and $200 in combination together with those. Same thing with the 16-inch model. The previous one we're looking at, this is a 14, and this is a 16-inch one. Now, another thing that I do want to point out is that if you just get the base M3 Max, this is the 14 and this is the 16. So 14 on the left, 16 on the right. Both of them are with the base Max, and we upgrade to 96 gigabytes of memory. You're talking about a fairly hefty price machine, because that memory upgrade is $800. You really have to think about, like, should you want to justify to do that? And if you're not really going to upgrade SoC, but you're just going to spend all that money to upgrade the RAM in the system, and you can justify using 96, I think that's great. So here's the thing. If you're going to keep your machine long-term, by all means, this is not a bad idea. But if you're only going to keep your machine for a very short term, or you're going to upgrade every generation, maybe not the best idea to do so. When it comes to the top, you start at 48, but you really start to scale up, and going to 64 is actually not that bad. It's $200. I mean, okay, but when you really jump to that 128 is $1,000, and that does carry a hefty price tag. So if we take the top SoC, this is the 14 on the left again, 16 on the right. Top M3 Max on both of these, and we upgraded 64 gigabytes of memory. You can see that the price is really now creeping up there. The price variation between these two machines are still going to be $300. And when we upgrade this to 128 gigabytes from the 14 and the 16-inch model, we are talking about a $5,000 laptop. Now, if you need to be working on the road and you need top performance with the largest display possible, this is a really great machine for you to do that. But if you don't really have that use, or if you're really just gonna get this for the top specs, and by the way, one of my followers did run the test with Photoshop, and it is faster, for example, than the M2 Ultra, which is the fastest one on the list right now, with 128 gigabytes memory by 3 seconds. So you're chasing seconds at that point, and I don't think it's necessarily worthwhile for the price tag. So that's my thought about that. So which one should you choose? I'm going to simply put it this way. If you're coming from an Intel generation machine, any of these SoC would do just fine, even just the more consumer-oriented one. I'm going to point that out in a second. But if you want the best, this is a chart that will guide you through the decision. And I would also say that the M1, M2 generation, these are becoming a really great value right now. So if you can find them on the used market, or if you can find them on Apple refurb site at an amazing value or clearance, it may not be a bad idea to purchase those instead of the latest generation. And you're still buying into Apple product in the end, so you're not really missing out on any experience. And yes, the M1 will still run Sonoma nowadays. So if you take a look at this for Lightroom Classic, good, better, best, you can see across there. I would say the better is the Max one, and then if you want the Ultra experience right now, well, the ultimate experience, it will be the 2 Ultra. When it comes to Photoshop, I really think that if you don't need that much more memory, if you're just doing a lot of Photoshop primarily, just get the M3 Pro, upgrade the memory. And when it comes to Pro, you can upgrade to 36 gigabytes, which I think you should be okay. But if you need anything more than that, you have to go to the Max, and the option becomes a little bit more confusing at that point for upgrading RAM. But I really think that the M3 Pro is a great one for Photoshop. When it comes to Capture One, we already seen a result in this video. M2 Max with the base SoC is the best one, or any other ones you get. Don't buy the top one. If you can get the base one, save some money, get the base one. That's going to be a better thing. When you work in video, highly recommend the Max or the Ultra, only because the double encoder decoder engine is going to speed up the time. As far as RAM go, minimum 16 or 18. When it really comes to pro workflow though, I really say you need at least 32 or 36 in a new machine to really get that maximum performance out of what you want to do, because like I said, the OS is already taking up memory. The moment you run Lightroom, it's already jamming it up. And let's face it, most of us are not disciplined enough to just restart our machine, run one app, close it out, shut down the machine to like launch another app. We're going to be running multiple apps at once. I know some of you are, but most of us, including myself, I'm not disciplined enough. Regarding the SSD size, minimum 512, which is pretty much the base for all these machines now, which is a good thing, but I still recommend that if you need more space or you want some more room to grow in the future, 1 terabyte is definitely not a bad option at all, because space does, grow over time. All right, here's the path for the upgrader. The best thing you can do is pause the screen, print this out, do a print screen, or whatever you want to do. Do this on an iPad like I'm doing right now. Circle the SoC that you're on. Let's say you're on the M1 Pro. Linear upgrade is not a bad idea to the Ultra. You're still getting the best performance there. You can also jump that way. You can also jump this way. There's many options. I mean, chances are if you get the Max now, you're not going to go and get the M2 Ultra, but you can also certainly do that as well. But there are so many different upgrade paths. Now, here's the thing though. These M1, M2, and M3, these are more consumer-oriented SoC. And anything with the moniker Pro, Max, or Ultra, these are more for pro workflow. If you do this for a living, do yourself a favor. Don't get the Air machine because it's passive cooling. Get one of the Pro machines and get also the one with the Pro, the Max, or the Ultra SoC, because it's going to be much better for your workflow in the long run. So that's my thoughts about that. Anyway, so this has been the comparison between the base M3 Max versus top M3 Max. And from what we have seen so far, the base one is a really compelling option. Although memory upgrade is a little bit fuzzy, I would probably say that if you're going to go with the base M3 Max with just a stock configuration, that is definitely a primo machine to consider. If you want to go to the top spec SoC, you're not getting that much more, but you are getting a little bit more memory in the system, up to 48, and you can also upgrade to 64. So the tiering of the memory is a little bit better on the top M3 Max, but the performance, I don't personally think it justifies the $500 price tag if you ask me personally. So anyway, I hope you find this helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell, and we trust.